Zektar adjusted the viewing screen on his observation ship and felt nothing but boredom. The silent watcher hung invisible in the dark space between two dead moons, its cloaking device making it as undetectable as a whisper in a storm. He had been watching the human colony world of New Haven for 3 days now, and the primitive beings below continued their simple daily routines, without any idea that death was coming for them. The Hegemony Intelligence Corps had given him this assignment with clear instructions. Document everything, record their technology, note their military responses, watch them lose. The data would go into the archives as another example of what happened when lesser species tried to expand beyond their proper place in the galaxy. Zektar had done this work 12 times before with 12 different species. The outcome was always the same. His long fingers moved across the control panel, bringing up the tactical display of New Haven's pathetic defenses. 3 orbital platforms that looked like they had been built from scrap metal, a handful of patrol ships that were obviously converted cargo haulers. Their main defense grid was so primitive that Zektar's sensors could map every weakness without even trying hard. The humans had spread themselves across 12 star systems in the past 50 years, claiming territory that belonged to the Dominion. The Council had finally decided to teach them a lesson. Zektar pulled up the intelligence files on the human military leader. Admiral Kate Morrison commanded what the humans called their colonial defense fleet. The image showed a middle-aged female with short gray hair and tired eyes. Her service record listed victories against pirates and successful evacuations of mining colonies when solar flares threatened them. Nothing in her background suggested she could handle a real military campaign against a superior force. The prediction models gave her fleet a 2.7% chance of survival past the first week of fighting. The morning sun rose over New Haven's main continent as Zektar watched through his long-range scanners. The human settlements looked peaceful from space. Small cities connected by transportation networks, agricultural areas that fed the population, industrial zones where they built their crude spacecraft and equipment. Children walked to schools while adults went to work in factories and offices. None of them knew that 3 massive Dominion war fleets were already moving through hyperspace toward them. Zektar had read the human historical files as part of his preparation. They were a young species, barely 400 years into space travel. Their home world had suffered through multiple wars, diseases, and natural disasters, but somehow they had survived and expanded outward. Their technology advanced quickly, but remained simple compared to races that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. What they lacked in sophistication they made up, for with stubborn determination to keep building and exploring. The first signs of the approaching Dominion fleet appeared on Zektar's sensors as tiny distortions in space. The massive ships were still hours away, but their gravity fields created ripples that his equipment could detect. Soon the humans would notice unusual readings on their primitive instruments. Zektar wondered how quickly they would realize what was happening, and how they would choose to face their destruction. Admiral Morrison's flagship, the Liberty Bell, moved into position above New Haven's northern pole. The ship looked like someone had taken 3 different vessels and welded them together with hopes and prayers. Its weapon systems were a mix of human designs and salvaged technology from other races. The armor plating had been repaired so many times that it resembled a patchwork quilt, more than military protection. Yet Morrison flew it with the pride of someone commanding the finest ship in space. Captain Jake Collins brought his squadron of converted mining ships into formation behind the Liberty Bell. The vessels had been built to crack asteroids and extract metals, but the humans had mounted weapons on them and called them warships. Their drilling lasers could cut through rock but would be useless against Dominion shields. Their cargo holds had been filled with makeshift missiles that looked more dangerous to their own crews than to any enemy. Collins himself was a former asteroid miner who had volunteered for military service when the expansion conflicts began. The first hyperspace signatures appeared on human sensors exactly when Zektar expected them to. Alarms began sounding across the Colonial Defense Fleet as junior officers reported impossible readings to their commanders. The Dominion ships were still emerging from hyperspace, but their massive energy signatures were already overwhelming human detection equipment. Morrison's tactical officer, a young man named Ben Hayes, tried to count the enemy vessels but gave up when the number passed 50. Zektar watched Morrison's response with professional interest. The human admiral stood on her bridge and looked at the tactical display showing overwhelming enemy forces approaching her world. Any rational commander would begin immediate evacuation procedures. Any experienced leader would try to negotiate surrender terms before the shooting started. Morrison did neither. She activated the fleet communication system and spoke to every human ship in the area with a calm voice that showed no trace of fear. All vessels, this is Admiral Morrison. We have enemy forces approaching New Haven with obvious hostile intent. Our job is to protect the people on this world and give them time to reach safety. Every minute we hold these ships off means more civilians can escape. Every enemy vessel we damage means fewer weapons pointed at other human worlds. Today we show the galaxy what happens when someone threatens our families. The human crews responded with enthusiasm that Zektar found puzzling. They knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. They knew their weapons were inferior, and their ships were vulnerable. Yet they moved into battle formation as if they believed they could win. Their communications channels filled with jokes and encouragement instead of prayers and goodbyes. Captain Collins told his miners that they had cracked tougher rocks than these alien ships. Lieutenant Sarah Parker promised her gunners that every shot would count. The humans acted like they were going to a difficult job, instead of certain death. The first Dominion war fleet completed its emergence from hyperspace and began moving toward New Haven. Zektar counted 67 vessels, including 12 heavy cruisers and 3 massive dreadnoughts. Their sleek hulls gleamed with energy shields and weapon ports. These ships had conquered dozens of worlds and destroyed hundreds of enemy fleets. The humans had 18 ships total, most of them converted civilian vessels with improvised weapons. The math was simple and brutal. Admiral Morrison gave the order to engage as the Dominion fleet entered weapons range. The human ships spread out into a loose formation that seemed chaotic compared to the precise battle line of their enemies. Morrison herself led the attack in the Liberty Belle, her patched-together flagship charging directly at a Dominion heavy cruiser that outweighed it by a factor of 10. The other human vessels followed their admiral toward what any reasonable observer would call suicide. Zektar began recording everything as the battle started. This would be a short fight, but the data would be valuable for future campaigns against other primitive species. He watched the first exchange of fire between human desperation and Dominion superiority, expecting to document another predictable victory for the forces of galactic order. What he witnessed instead would change everything he thought he knew about warfare, courage, and the impossible things that ordinary beings could accomplish when they refused to accept defeat. The first salvo of Dominion plasma cannons lit up space like deadly fireworks. Zektar watched 3 human ships disappear instantly as the superior alien weapons cut through their makeshift armor like paper. The remaining human vessels should have broken formation and fled, but instead they accelerated toward the enemy fleet with reckless determination that made no tactical sense. Captain Jake Collins led his squadron of mining ships directly at the largest Dominion dreadnought. His vessel, the Rockbreaker, had been designed to drill through asteroids, not fight wars, but Collins treated the massive enemy ship like just another mining job. He ordered his crew to route all power to the industrial drilling lasers and prepare for point-blank engagement. The other mining captains followed his example, their converted cargo ships racing towards certain destruction with their primitive weapons charging. Zektar had seen desperate attacks before, but nothing like what the humans were attempting. Collins brought his ship so close to the dreadnought that the enemy point defense systems could not track him properly. The Rockbreaker's drilling laser, designed to cut through solid rock, began carving deep wounds in the Dominion ship's hull. The alien vessel's shields were calibrated to stop energy weapons and kinetic projectiles, not industrial equipment operating at 0 range. The human mining ships swarmed around the dreadnought like angry insects. Their drilling beams and cutting torches, never intended for combat, found weak points in the enemy armor that military weapons would have missed. Captain Steve Rogers in the Deep Digger managed to cut through the dreadnought's main engine housing before Dominion fighters could destroy his ship. The massive alien vessel began listing to one side as secondary. Explosions rippled along its hull. Admiral Morrison coordinated the chaotic battle from the Liberty Belle while dodging plasma, fire that could have vaporized her ship with a single hit. She used the human fleet's smaller size as an advantage, darting between the larger Dominion vessels and firing at their weapon systems with surgical precision. Her gunners, led by Lieutenant Sarah Parker, had learned to target the joints and connectors that held the alien ships together, rather than trying to punch through their heavy armor. What confused Zektar most was how the humans kept fighting even when their cause seemed hopeless. The corvette Braveheart lost its main engines and half its crew, but continued firing with backup weapons until the ship broke apart. The freighter New Dawn rammed a Dominion cruiser after its weapons failed, the human captain shouting defiance over the radio as both vessels exploded together. Every destroyed human ship seemed to inspire the others to fight harder rather than surrender. The orbital defense platforms around New Haven opened fire as the battle moved closer to the planet. These installations were even more primitive than the human ships, basically large guns mounted on metal frameworks. But their operators showed the same stubborn courage as the fleet crews. Station Commander Amy Richards coordinated the platform attacks while evacuating civilians from the surface below. Her weapons could barely scratch Dominion shields, but she kept shooting anyway. Zektar noticed something strange happening among the Dominion forces. Their formation began to waver as individual captains found themselves dealing with human tactics they had never encountered. The aliens had trained to fight other organized militaries with predictable strategies. They had not prepared for enemies who turned mining equipment into weapons or used cargo ships as guided missiles. Several Dominion vessels collided with each other as they tried to track the fast-moving human fighters. The human ground forces on New Haven showed the same puzzling behavior as their space fleet. Colonel Amy Richards organized civilian resistance using farming equipment converted into weapons. Elderly humans fought alongside teenagers while teachers and doctors took up arms to defend their communities. The humans seemed to think that ordinary people could become soldiers just by deciding to fight, a concept that baffled Zektar's military training. When Dominion troops finally landed on New Haven's surface, they expected to face organized military units. Instead, they encountered farmers with hunting rifles, mechanics with improvised explosives, and medical workers who treated wounded enemies even while under fire. Lieutenant Ben Hayes led a squad of volunteers in an attack on a Dominion landing zone, using modified construction vehicles as makeshift tanks. The humans had no proper military doctrine, but they fought with desperate creativity that kept surprising their enemies. The most confusing incident happened when a Dominion transport crashed near the human settlement of Miller's Point. Lieutenant Hayes could have left the alien survivors to die, but instead he organized a rescue mission that saved both human and Dominion wounded. Hayes himself pulled an injured alien soldier from a burning vehicle, while enemy forces fired at his position. The act made no tactical sense but somehow boosted human morale throughout the entire battle zone. Dr. Helen Davis ran the Emergency Medical Center in New Haven's capital city while bombs fell around the hospital. She treated human and alien casualties without discrimination, working 18-hour shifts to save lives that military logic said were not worth saving. Her medical teams performed surgery in basement shelters and set up aid stations in subway tunnels, refusing to abandon their posts even when Dominion forces surrounded the city. Zektar recorded everything but found himself struggling to understand what he was seeing. The humans were losing the battle exactly as predicted, but they were not behaving like a defeated species. Every small victory seemed to matter more to them than the overall tactical situation. When Captain Collins successfully disabled the Dreadnought's main weapons, the human fleet celebrated as if they had won the entire war. When Hayes rescued the alien soldiers, other human units began showing mercy to captured enemies, an attitude that spread through their forces like a contagious disease. The orbital platforms fell one by one as Dominion heavy weapons systematically destroyed them. Commander Richards kept fighting from the last platform until the structure broke apart around her, broadcasting encouragement to human forces planetside as her station died. The human fleet was reduced to 6 ships still capable of fighting, but Admiral Morrison refused all surrender demands from the Dominion commander. The final assault on New Haven's surface began as Dominion ground forces advanced on the remaining human strongholds. Zektar expected the humans to surrender once they realized the situation was hopeless, but instead they prepared for a last stand that would accomplish nothing except getting more of them killed. The humans seemed to believe that dying for their beliefs was better than living under alien rule, another concept that challenged everything Zektar thought he knew about rational behavior. As the battle entered its final phase, Zektar found himself making detailed notes about human psychology, rather than just recording their military capabilities. These beings fought with an intensity that went far beyond simple survival instinct. They seemed willing to sacrifice everything for abstract ideas like freedom and dignity, treating these concepts as more valuable than their own lives. The Dominion would win this battle, but the cost had been far higher than anyone expected. 3 months after the fall of New Haven, Zektar moved his observation ship to the industrial world of Forge Prime, where the next phase of the human campaign was beginning. The Dominion had won at New Haven, but the victory had taken 2 weeks longer than planned and cost them 12 ships instead of the expected 0. The human resistance had been completely destroyed, but somehow news of their desperate fight had spread to every human world in the sector. What Zektar witnessed at Forge Prime made him question everything he thought he understood about warfare. The humans were not just fighting the same way they had before, they were learning from their defeat and adapting with shocking speed. Chief Engineer Lisa Parker had converted the planet's manufacturing facilities from civilian production to military weapons in just 8 weeks. The factories that once built mining equipment and transport ships were now producing fusion torpedoes and fighter craft at a rate that should have been impossible with human technology. The most disturbing thing was how the humans had modified their weapons based on what they learned at New Haven. Parker's engineers had studied the wreckage of Dominion ships and figured out how to build missiles that could penetrate alien shields using principles the Dominion had never seen before. Instead of trying to overpower the energy barriers, the human torpedoes created resonance frequencies that made the shields collapse from within. The technique was crude and unreliable, but it worked often enough to be genuinely dangerous. Commander Ryan Burke led the human fleet at Forge Prime with tactics that seemed to come from studying every mistake made at New Haven. His ships moved in loose formations that could scatter instantly when attacked, then reform to strike at weak points in enemy lines. Burke had somehow trained his captains to coordinate their attacks using simple radio signals that the Dominion forces ignored because they seemed too primitive to be effective. The human fleet fought like a pack of hunting animals rather than a traditional military force. Zektar watched the second major battle of the war unfold with growing unease. The Dominion still had superior numbers and technology, but the humans were no longer the helpless victims they had been 3 months earlier. Captain Tony Martinez led a squadron of heavy fighters in a series of hit-and-run attacks that slowly wore down the alien fleet's defensive capabilities. His pilots used modified civilian aircraft that had been armed with weapons salvaged from destroyed Dominion ships, creating hybrid vessels that were unpredictable and hard to counter. The ground campaign on Forge Prime revealed even more disturbing developments in human warfare. Colonel Sandra Clark had organized the civilian population into a resistance network that operated more like a natural disaster than a military force. Her people appeared without warning to attack supply convoys, then vanished into the industrial complexes where they could hide among the machinery and support structures. The Dominion forces found themselves fighting an entire planet, rather than just its military. Dr. Helen Davis had established field hospitals throughout Forge Prime's underground tunnel systems, treating wounded from both sides while somehow staying ahead of the advancing Dominion forces. Her medical teams had learned to perform surgery in moving vehicles and set up operating rooms in abandoned factories. The Human Medical Corps seemed to treat saving lives as their primary mission, regardless of which side those lives belonged to, an attitude that was beginning to affect Dominion morale in unexpected ways. What truly amazed Zektar was how quickly human technology was advancing under pressure. Engineer Parker had teams working around the clock to reverse engineer captured Dominion equipment, but instead of just copying alien designs, they were improving them with human modifications that actually made the weapons more effective. A Dominion plasma rifle in human hands became lighter, more reliable, and easier to manufacture than the original version. The humans seemed to understand that simple solutions were often better than complex ones. The psychological warfare was becoming just as important as the physical battles. Dr. Davis had begun broadcasting messages throughout Dominion space, not propaganda about human superiority, but simple stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She told the galaxy about farmers who became soldiers, teachers who learned to build weapons, and children who helped adults fight for their freedom. These broadcasts were reaching Dominion, worlds where subject populations were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about their own situations. Tar found himself studying human history more carefully as he tried to understand what he was witnessing. The humans had survived ice ages, plagues, and global wars by adapting to circumstances that should have destroyed them. Every disaster in their past had taught them new ways to overcome impossible challenges. Their entire species seemed to operate on the principle that no problem was truly unsolvable if enough people worked together to find an answer. The Battle of Forge Prime lasted 6 weeks instead of the predicted 10 days. The human defenders used the planet's industrial infrastructure as both weapon and fortress, turning factories into strongholds and assembly lines into death traps. Captain Julia Roberts led a desperate defense of the main manufacturing complex, holding off Dominion forces for 3 days with nothing but improvised weapons and absolute determination. When the complex finally fell, the humans had destroyed most of the machinery, rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The most significant development was how other alien races were beginning to react to the human war effort. Species that had been conquered by the Dominion decades earlier were quietly sending supplies and intelligence to human forces. The rigid Dominion hierarchy had no procedures for dealing with subjects who decided to stop being subjects. Zektar began receiving reports of unrest on worlds that had been peaceful for generations, all inspired by news of human resistance. Commander Burke's final stand at Forge Prime demonstrated everything the humans had learned about fighting impossible odds. His remaining ships conducted a fighting retreat that lasted for days, each vessel covering the others as they fell back toward the edge of the system. Burke himself stayed behind with a skeleton crew to detonate the orbital shipyards, denying the Dominion a prize that would have been worth more than the entire planet. The explosion could be seen from 3 star systems away, a signal to every human world that their people would never stop fighting. As Dominion forces consolidated their grip on Forge Prime, Zektar realized that something fundamental had changed in the nature of this conflict. The humans were still losing battles, but they were no longer the same species that had been surprised at New Haven. Each defeat was teaching them lessons that made them more dangerous in the next encounter. The Dominion was winning a war against an enemy that was evolving faster than anyone thought possible, and Zektar was beginning to wonder if victory against such opponents was even meaningful. 6 months into what the Dominion Council had predicted would be a quick campaign, Zektar found his observation ship positioned near the human homeworld approaches at a place the humans called Titan's Gate. The massive space station that controlled access to Earth's solar system was supposed to be the final obstacle before total human surrender. Instead, Zektar was watching the largest fleet engagement in Dominion history unfold as Admiral Kate Morrison prepared to make her last stand with an impossible collection of ships that had no right to be effective in combat. Morrison's fleet looked like a scrapyard that had learned to fly. Vessels that had been destroyed at previous battles had been rebuilt with parts from other ships, creating hybrid craft that defied every rule of naval architecture. The flagship Liberty Bell now carried weapons from 6 different alien races, all integrated into a patchwork defense system that somehow worked better than its individual components. Captain Jake Collins commanded a squadron of ships that were half human construction and half salvaged Dominion technology, crewed by miners and merchants who had become some of the most dangerous fighter pilots in the galaxy. The turning point came when Captain Steve Rogers piloted the first fully human ship equipped with reverse-engineered Dominion technology. The vessel Phoenix had been built in secret shipyards hidden in asteroid fields, using plans that combined the best of alien engineering with human improvements that made the original designs more reliable and easier to maintain. Rogers and his crew had spent months learning to use weapons that were more advanced than anything humans had possessed a year earlier, but they operated them with the same fearless determination that had characterized human resistance from the beginning. Zektar watched in amazement as the human fleet demonstrated tactical coordination that rivaled the best Dominion formations. Morrison had somehow trained her captains to work together using communication methods that the alien forces considered too primitive to bother jamming. Simple radio signals and light flashes allowed the human ships to maintain contact, even when Dominion electronic warfare systems knocked out more sophisticated communications. The humans were using their technological disadvantage as a strength, relying on systems so basic that they were nearly impossible to disrupt. The battle began when 3 Dominion war fleets emerged from hyperspace, expecting to face the last organized human resistance. What they found instead was a carefully prepared trap that used the gravitational fields of nearby moons to channel the alien ships into killing zones where human weapons could be most effective. Morrison had studied every previous engagement and learned to use space itself as a weapon, creating tactical situations where superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. Captain Tony Martinez led the first wave of human fighters in a coordinated attack that targeted the command and control systems of the leading Dominion ships. His pilots flew converted civilian craft that had been modified with weapons and armor, using techniques perfected during months of desperate fighting. Martinez himself piloted a former cargo shuttle that had been armed with missiles built in basement workshops on a dozen different worlds. The weapon systems were crude compared to military standards, but they were designed by people who understood that reliability was more important than sophistication. The most shocking moment came when human reinforcements began arriving in the middle of the battle. Zector had been monitoring space around Titan's Gate and knew that no official military forces were approaching, but suddenly the combat zone filled with civilian vessels of every description. Merchant captains like Sandra Clark and transport pilots like Ben Hayes brought their ships into the fight without any formal training or military authority. They simply decided that their people needed help and showed up to provide it. Dr. Helen Davis coordinated the civilian fleet from a converted hospital ship that had been built inside a former luxury liner. Her vessel carried medical supplies and repair equipment for the human fleet, while also serving as a command center for the volunteer forces. Davis had become something more than a doctor during the long months of war, evolving into a leader who could inspire ordinary people to attempt extraordinary things. Her broadcasts to the civilian ships were calm and encouraging, treating the desperate battle as just another medical emergency that required everyone to work together. The Dominion forces found themselves fighting not just a military fleet, but an entire civilization that had decided to resist. Factory workers arrived in industrial ships armed with construction equipment converted to weapons. Farmers brought cargo vessels loaded with improvised explosives. Even passenger liners joined the fight, their crews using the ship's communication systems to coordinate attacks while their passengers helped load weapons and tend wounded. The humans had turned their entire society into a military force without losing the civilian values that made them worth. Defending Commander Ryan Burke demonstrated the new level of human tactical thinking when he led a squadron of heavy cruisers in a complex maneuver that exploited weaknesses in Dominion formation doctrine. His ships pretended to retreat, while actually drawing the enemy fleet into a crossfire between hidden human forces and the defensive guns of Titan's Gate Station. Burke had learned that the aliens expected their opponents to follow established military procedures, so he won by doing things that no proper military would attempt. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate combat zone. News of the human stand at Titan's Gate was being broadcast throughout Dominion space by underground networks that had grown bolder as the war continued. Species that had been conquered generations earlier were watching humans fight impossible odds with weapons built in garage workshops and ships held together with hope and determination. The carefully maintained image of Dominion invincibility was cracking under the pressure of an enemy that refused to accept defeat. As final Zector recorded the moment when the tide of battle shifted decisively in favor of the humans. A coordinated attack by Morrison's fleet and the civilian reinforcements broke the main Dominion formation and sent the alien ships retreating toward the edge of the system. For the first time in their history, Dominion forces were running from an enemy they had expected to crush easily. The humans had not just survived the assault on their homeworld approaches, they had won a victory that would change the balance of power throughout the galaxy. As the defeated Dominion fleets limped away from Titan's Gate, Zector realized that he was no longer observing a simple military campaign. He was witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare, where ordinary people could become extraordinary soldiers and primitive technology could defeat advanced weapons. Through sheer determination and creative thinking, the humans had proven that no enemy was truly invincible if enough people were willing to stand up and fight for their freedom. The war that was supposed to end in weeks had stretched into its 10th month, when Zector received urgent orders from the Dominion Council. The human resistance had grown beyond all predictions, and was now threatening the stability of the entire galactic empire. Species that had been peaceful subjects for centuries were openly rebelling. After seeing humans fight impossible odds and win, the Council demanded that Zektar abandon his observation, mission and report directly to the capital world of Dominion Prime, where the final battle of the war would be. Zektar's ship arrived at the capital system to find chaos instead of the ordered defense he expected. The massive orbital platforms that protected Dominion Prime were firing on approaching ships that flew banners from dozens of different races. The human fleet led by Admiral Kate Morrison had somehow convinced half the galaxy to join their rebellion against Dominion rule. Ancient enemies were fighting side by side while former subjects turned their weapons against their old masters. The rigid hierarchy that had held the Empire together for thousands of years was collapsing as ordinary beings decided they had suffered enough. Admiral Morrison's flagship, Liberty Bell, looked like a symbol of everything the war had become. The ship carried weapons and crew members from 20 different species, all working together under human leadership to bring down the empire that had oppressed them. Captain Jake Collins commanded a mixed squadron of human miners, alien merchants, and former Dominion soldiers who had switched sides after witnessing human mercy toward prisoners. The fleet that approached, Dominion Prime, was not just human anymore but represented every race that had ever dreamed of freedom. The final battle began when Dominion, loyalist forces tried to prevent the rebel fleet from reaching the capital world. Zektar watched from his observation post as Admiral Morrison deployed tactics that combined human creativity with alien technology in ways that no military academy had ever taught. Her ships moved in formations that changed constantly, adapting to enemy responses faster than Dominion computers could calculate counter-strategies. The humans had learned that flexibility was more valuable than firepower when fighting enemies who relied on rigid procedures. Captain Steve Rogers piloted the Phoenix in a daring attack on the main Dominion command ship, using maneuvers that his human reflexes could perform, but that alien pilots found impossible to duplicate. His vessel had been upgraded with technology from 6 different races, creating a unique fighting machine that represented the best qualities of each species involved in the rebellion. Rogers and his mixed crew fought with the desperate courage that had become the trademark of human resistance. But now that courage was backed by weapons and tactics that could match anything the Dominion possessed. The most decisive moment came when Captain Julia Roberts led a boarding party onto the Dominion flagship to capture the enemy commander alive. Roberts had learned during the long months of fighting that humans possessed an unusual ability to inspire loyalty and cooperation among other species. Her boarding team included former enemies who now fought alongside humans because they had witnessed acts of mercy and compassion that changed their understanding of what leadership could mean. The Dominion officers surrendered without fighting when they realized that their own crew members were helping the human boarders. Dr. Helen Davis coordinated the evacuation of Dominion civilian populations as the battle raged around the capital world. Her medical ships moved through the combat zone, rescuing wounded from both sides, while broadcasting messages of peace to anyone willing to listen. Davis had become a symbol of human values during the war, proving that strength could come from helping others rather than destroying them. Her actions during the final battle convinced many Dominion citizens that humans offered a better future than the empire that had ruled them through fear. Zektar found himself making a decision that would have been impossible when the war began. As the Dominion forces collapsed around him, he chose to reveal his presence to the human fleet and request permission to come aboard Admiral Morrison's ship. The months of observation had changed his understanding of what the humans represented, and he realized that his original mission to document their defeat had become meaningless. The humans had not just survived their encounter with the Dominion, they had transformed the nature of galactic civilization itself. Admiral Morrison received Zektar in the Liberty Bell's main conference room, where representatives from dozens of species were planning the post-war reconstruction of galactic government. Morrison herself looked older and more tired than when the war began, but her eyes held a confidence that came from leading an impossible victory against overwhelming odds. She listened to Zektar's explanation of his observation mission, without anger or accusations, treating him like a former enemy who could become a valuable ally in building a better future. The discussion that followed revealed the true scope of what the humans had accomplished. They had not just won a military victory but had created a new model for how different species could work together based on cooperation rather than domination. Dr. Davis explained how their medical corps had treated wounded enemies throughout the war, gradually convincing many Dominion soldiers that humans offered mercy rather than revenge to those who surrendered. Captain Collins described how human mining crews had shared their industrial techniques with other races, creating an economic foundation for rebuilding damaged worlds. The formal end of the war came when the Dominion Council finally agreed to negotiate a surrender that would transform the Empire into a voluntary federation of independent worlds. Admiral Morrison insisted that the peace treaty include provisions for helping former Dominion worlds develop their own governments and economies without human interference. The humans had learned that true victory meant creating conditions where war would become unnecessary rather than simply defeating current enemies. Zektar's final report to the former Dominion Council became a document that explained how humans had achieved the impossible through determination, creativity, and an unusual willingness to treat enemies as potential friends. He described how they had won not because they were stronger or smarter than their opponents, but because they refused to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. Their greatest weapon had been hope itself, combined with an absolute refusal to abandon anyone who needed help. The story ended with Zektar accepting an invitation to serve as an ambassador in the new galactic government, helping to establish peaceful relations between species that had been enemies for generations. He had begun the war as an observer expecting to document human failure, but instead had witnessed the birth of a civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest. The humans had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together for goals larger than themselves, and that lesson would reshape the galaxy for generations to come.